projects going is he'd go to even to the extent of writing letters to the saints in the San Pete Valley to see if they could send down some wagon loads of potatoes so that the workers on the temple could have something to eat. Just always looking for ways where provisions could be found to support the work on the temple. Those two projects really kept the saints here in this valley. He actually had converted some of those people that had settled in San Pete County, because a lot of those folks were of Scandinavian origin, and he had met and taught them in the mission field, and so he had ties to the people in San Pete County. And many of them had Danish and Swedish roots. And so it was a natural for him to ask for help from those good friends of his.
They sent supply wagons north to get donations. They went as far as San Pete County, as far as Fairview in San Pete County. The men would go ahead and get all the donations they could, and then these wagons, there were 6 different wagons, some of them with 2 teams and some of them with 1 team. And then they would come and gather the produce up, anything that people would donate. Clothing, food, anything, and they would bring it back to St. George to pay the workers that were working on the tabernacle and the temple. At one time, the men that had done this came back, and they donated half of their time, which was a common way for people that worked for the church. They donate half their time and take pay for half their time. So when they got back to St. George, they found that no one in St. George had any flour. So they took their share of the flour and distributed it to the people so that they would have flour to eat.
They couldn't be supplied with wages, but they did get their, so that they'd have something to eat. The church had a big tithing herd out at the Pipe Springs, and a huge element there, and several other encampments in the neighborhood with cattle. The Mormon church set up a slaughterhouse, they set up a bakery, and so that these people could be fed while they were here. And the different ladies of the community then did the cooking and patched up their clothes and sewed and so on, and some of the material coming out of the cotton factory helped to repair and give them clothing.
About every week or 2 weeks, they would bring 10 or 12 cattle in to St. George to feed the workers on the temple and to give to some of them that had families that lived nearby, to give them something to eat. And they would bring them in to St. George. My grandfather Oxborough, he was working in a logging mill up in Beaver, and they was using these timbers to build, and I think they're picking some of them out for the temple down here, but church went up there and asked him to come down to St. George and to help them there at the temple. He was a baker and a cook, so he also learned how to be a butcher. And he come down and he used to butcher these cattle. They didn't have electricity or gas or anything to bake with, and they didn't have stoves of any kind. They had Dutch ovens, but that's about all that they had. But Grandpa had learned to make himself an oven, and he made it with a door on the front of it that he could open, and then he had a place in the back where he could let a little smoke out. And Grandpa would take maybe cedar wood, coal if he could get it, anything that he could get that would heat those rocks up, and he would fill this in there and then adjust the air so that it would burn and burn and burn, and it heated those rocks up. Then after it had heated the rocks up, he would rake out all of the ashes and stuff out of it, and then put his stuff in there that he wanted to bake. He would make a dish for their breakfast and their dinner and their supper and put it on a plate. When they first built the temple, they dedicated the bottom part of it where the baptismal font was first, and there was a compartment down in there that I don't know very many people ever knew was there, but they would, my mother told me she would take these plates over. She knew how many plates she had, her father did, how many he had to fix, and she'd take these plates over and set them on the sill of the temple, and she'd go back in a little while and the plates would be set back there empty. Members of the Quorum of the 12 and the high officers in the church were down there because the federal government was after them, trying to discourage polygamy and plural marriage, and they was after them for that.
In 1871, Brigham Young chose this site. My personal feeling is he chose this site because of its being elevated. People were critical of the site because it was marshy. And they said, let's move the temple about half a block and we'll get out of the way of this marsh. But if you move the temple half a block, you're at the bottom of the hill. Either way, see. And he wanted to make this statement, and he said, no, we will drain the site. And they took a long, deep breath and said, okay. So they went to work to put in pipe and drain the site, and they dug down deep as much as they could get the stuff out, and they found where the spring was coming out, and they piped it and got the water out of there. But, of course, the water had been there for centuries. And so they had to deal with the problem of this big hole that was terribly wet. And so they went up on the Black Hill. They built a road, a gradual road up there that wagons could take up and down a heavy load. And they went up there, and hundreds of wagon loads of small rocks, about the size of a large softball, I think, or some bigger, some smaller, filled those wagons, brought them down that road, brought them to here, and dumped those rocks into that huge hole. It took them about 15 months more time than they had anticipated in building the building to fill that hole and get the rock solid. So they'd put it in the hole, then they had to pound it down in the hole. And they developed a very elaborate pounder. They had an old cannon, and they encased the cannon in round sticks of wood and bound it together, probably with leather. And then they attached it to a cord or a chain and built something like an oil derrick, that you could pull that cannon up to the top of the derrick, and of course you'd have a horse way out here in the back that did the pulling, and then they were able to trip it, and the cannon would fall, and it would hit, it just hit about 6 inches, and they'd do it 3 times at least until it was pretty solid. Then they'd roll the whole derrick 6 inches or so forward, pull it back up again several times, down it, and pound it in again, and they would do that the whole length of the interior of the building. Then they would roll it over 6 inches and start coming all the way back. And can you imagine how long it would take to do all that pounding? And then they would put more loads of stone in and pound it and pound it. The saying around town is that there's more rock in the ground than there is above the ground. But they had to get that whole area absolutely firm. They said every place had to be such that you could drop the cannon and it would bounce 3 times. It was that firm. Then they had already by that time sent the crew up a little farther on the mountain and found great big huge pieces of lava that they could split.
Then they had worked with this rock. They couldn't get it so that they could handle the big pieces that they needed. They couldn't when they built the tabernacle. And Erastus Snow went to some of his men that was pretty good in themselves and figure some way that we can do that. So they made what they called a feather wedge drill. And they went up and they tried it, and they would come along, maybe they might have a rock 15 foot long. They would come along and put a drill about every 2 feet along there and get them drills. They'd have that many, and then with a jackhammer, they'd come up. They'd come clear across, hit every one of them, like that, and then start over. They got so that they could slice those old black rock with that feather wedge drill. But once they got them cut into those long pieces, they could chop them off any way that they wanted to.
Why volcanic rock, by the way? Because it's not porous. You couldn't do it with sandstone. The sandstone would just dissolve. So then they got these huge pieces, a little larger than a casket. Now, they were so heavy, they couldn't lift them up on the wagons. So they jacked the wagons up a little higher and would roll the wagons on top of the stones and then have dig under the stone and put chains there and wrap them up and hitch them up onto the wagon underneath about 6 inches off the ground, and then slowly take those stones down that hill and bring to the site, and then those stones would be lowered onto the bed of pressed small rocks and would be laid as the foundation all the way around, and some in the middle for the baptistry. And then they kept building, and they built lava clear up almost, well, at least a half a story above the ground. And if you see the old pictures of the temple, it wasn't white all the way down to the ground. It was white where the red sandstone was and stopped where the volcanic rock ended. But then later they covered the volcanic rock too. So it was just an enormous job. It wasn't like you had a lot of finished masonry. It was just volumes and volumes of the small rocks and then the large ones. And it's served as a magnificent foundation. Once they got that foundation laid and the walls up, then they moved from the volcanic to the red sandstone. The red sandstone, of course, they can work much easier, and there's much more of it. That had a great quarry developed for the tabernacle, and they had great skill in working on the red sandstone. So they went from about halfway up the first story, sandstone, the rest of the building. They did not do finished sandstone like at the tabernacle.
And of course, when they built the temple, they needed timber right away. And they chose this spot because of the lack of limbs, and the area was fairly stable and not too hard to get to. The temple trail became very significant and very important when they began to build the temple. That was a huge temple, a large temple, several stories high and over 100 feet long and wide, and a very magnificent temple. They wanted good lumber, good timber, and they tried to pick the best regardless of how far they had to go after it. They had to go some 80 miles to come out here to get it. And so they had to build a trail. They sent 40 men in this area under Brother Gardner and Brother Blake and others to bring the timber in. They had to build a road. It took them some 43 days to get the road built from St. George to Mount Trumbull. And then a team of horses would begin coming out. First of all, they had to have a sawmill established here, a steam sawmill. And then Mrs. Gardner did the cooking and set up a little boarding house. And then several men were doing the cutting of the timber. A couple of men would be cutting the timber, and then several men would be working at the sawmill, sawing the lumber up. And then they had another crew who were just freighting, constantly going back and forth from St. George to Mount Trumbull, picking up the sawed lumber and returning it to the temple for building of the temple. They sawed 1 million board feet of lumber for the St. George Temple at this spot. The reason they use this timber, notice first of all, it's straight. It's a good straight timber, and it's tall, and it's uniform, and it doesn't have many knots in it, and it's very easy to saw up. It's a very good grade. It's a ponderosa pine, and it's a very good grade of pine for choice lumber, grade A lumber. They needed a great number of workers for the temple. In fact, at the very peak of the operation in building the temple, at the highest peak, they had some 250 men working on that temple. Now, about 100 of them were on the building itself, and another 100 were on the two quarries, in the Red Rock Quarry and in the Black Rock Quarry, the Black Rock being used for the bottom of the temple. The red rock was above ground. And